Can you imagine it? A 72-year-old mother forced out of her own bedroom and shoved into the freezing garage of the very house she spent her life building, and the son she loved most just stood there and watched without saying a word. This is the story the woman and her family thought they had broken. But little did they know they had just awakened the most dangerous person in the house. Hit the like button right now, comment the city or country you're watching from, so I know how far this story has traveled, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next shocking stories. The morning I woke up and couldn't find my reading glasses, I didn't panic. I figured I'd left them on the nightstand the way I always did, right next to the photograph of Harold and me on our 25th anniversary. The one where he had his arm around my shoulder, and we were both squinting into the sun because neither of us thought to face the other direction. I reached for them, in the dark, before the light even came through the curtains. My hand found nothing, just cold, bare wood that wasn't my nightstand at all. I lay there for a moment, staring up at a ceiling that didn't look right, too low. The water stain in the corner was wrong, it was a circle, not the long brown streak I'd memorized over 40 years of looking up at it during sleepless nights. The smell was wrong, too. Dust and motor oil and something metallic underneath it all, like old coins left too long in a drawer. I sat up slowly, the way a woman my age has to, joints complaining, back making a sound like crumpling paper, and I looked around at where I was sleeping. The garage. My garage. Harold's garage, really, because he'd been the one who spent every Saturday out here tinkering with that old lawnmower or organizing his tools into rows so neat they looked like museum exhibits. His pegboard was still on the wall. Some of his wrenches were still hanging there, silhouettes of the ones Lauren had already decided she didn't need and hadn't bothered to move. I was sleeping in my dead husband's garage, and somehow I had let it get this far. Let me go back, because this story doesn't start in the garage. It starts the way all painful things start, which is with love, or what I believed was love at the time. My name is Evelyn Carter. I'm 72 years old. I was married to Harold Carter for 44 years until a heart attack took him from me on a Tuesday morning in October 3 years ago. He was drinking his coffee and reading the newspaper at the kitchen table, the real paper, not his phone, because Harold said staring at screens over breakfast was uncivilized, and then he was gone. Just like that. No warning. No goodbye. I grieved. Lord, I grieved. But I also kept the house. I kept the garden. I kept the life we'd built together on Sycamore Lane. In the house we'd bought when Nathan was 3 years old and the neighborhood was still half-empty lots and muddy construction roads. I planted the oak tree in the backyard that was now so big it threw shade over half the yard. I painted every room in that house at least twice over the decades. I replaced the kitchen tile myself with YouTube tutorials, and a bad back and a stubbornness Harold used to call both my greatest quality and my most exasperating one. That house was not just a building, it was the accumulation of a life. Every corner of it held something. Every scratch on the hardwood floor had a story. The dent in the hallway wall that was from Nathan's 10th birthday, when he decided a baseball could be thrown indoors without consequence. The faded patch of carpet near the front window that was from 20 years of our old dog Biscuit lying in the same sunbeam every afternoon, until she didn't anymore. It was mine. Paid off, deeded mine, and I was proud of that. Nathan called me in February, about 14 months ago. He didn't call often enough I'd made peace with that. Mostly, but when he did, his voice always had that particular quality of someone trying to sound casual when they were anything but. "Mom," he said, "Lauren and I have been going through a rough patch." I didn't ask him to explain what kind of rough patch. I'd already suspected. Nathan worked in commercial real estate, and the market had been gutting people in that industry for the past 2 years. Lauren managed a small event planning business that had never quite found its footing after the pandemic years had hollowed it out. I'd watched the signs accumulate over family dinners, the way they'd stopped ordering dessert, the way Lauren had stopped wearing the jewelry she used to love, the way Nathan looked tired in a way that wasn't about sleep. "How bad is it?" I asked. "We're behind on the apartment," he said. 3 months. The landlord's been patient, but "Come stay with me," I said. I said it before he even finished the sentence. I said it because he was my son. I said it because the house had 4 bedrooms, and only one of them was being used. I said it because Harold would have said the same thing, and I knew it down in my bones. "Mom, we don't want to impose Nathan." I used the voice I'd been using since he was small, the one that meant the discussion was settled. This is what the house is for. This is what family is for. Come home. He exhaled like he'd been holding that breath for weeks. They moved in on a Saturday with a rental truck, and Lauren's parents helping carry boxes. Lauren's parents were Frank and Diane Kowalski, a couple in their late 60s who I'd met maybe a dozen times over the years of my son's marriage. They were fine people, I thought. Polite enough. Diane brought a casserole the first night, and Frank shook my hand at the door and thanked me. I made up the master guest room for Nathan and Lauren, the one with the attached bathroom, the nicest guest room, because they were young and they were struggling, and I wanted them to be comfortable. I put fresh towels out. I bought Lauren's preferred brand of coffee because Nathan had mentioned it once, offhand, months ago, and I'd remembered. I was happy, genuinely. The house had been too quiet for too long. First changes were so small I almost didn't notice them. Lauren rearranged the living room furniture within the first 2 weeks. She said the couch placement was blocking the natural flow, which I had never thought about in 40 years of living there. But I smiled and said, of course. She replaced the kitchen hand towels with one she'd brought from their apartment. She moved my collection of small pottery figurines, pieces Harold and I had collected from every trip we'd taken together from the windowsill in the dining room to a box, so they don't get broken, she said. I told myself these were small things. They were small things. But here is what I know about small things. They are never just small things. They are the first sentences of a much longer story, and by the time you understand what story is being told, you are already deep inside it. In the third week, Lauren began reorganizing the kitchen. She moved things, pots, spices, the good china I'd received as a wedding gift, to different cabinets without telling me. I'd reach for the salt and find dish soap. I'd look for the colander and discover she'd put it in the pantry. When I mentioned it, she smiled the way a person smiles when they're certain they're right and they're managing someone they consider beneath correcting. I just reorganized for efficiency, she said. You'll get used to it. I will get used to it. In my own kitchen, where I had cooked every meal for 44 years. I said nothing. I was still in the grace period of gratitude. I was still telling myself this was temporary discomfort for a good reason. Nathan saw nothing, or chose to see nothing. He was working longer hours, trying to pull their finances back from the edge, and I understood that. I didn't want to add to his burden. So I stayed quiet, and Lauren interpreted my quiet the way people like Lauren always interpret quiet as consent. Frank and Diane started visiting on weekends at first. Then a weekend here, a few days there. Then Lauren mentioned, carefully, over dinner one evening, that they were going through some things too, and might need a place to stay for a bit. I looked at Nathan. Nathan looked at his food. How long? I asked. Just temporarily, Lauren said. You have those empty bedrooms. I had 2 empty bedrooms besides the one Nathan and Lauren occupied. One had been Nathan's childhood room, which I'd kept more or less as a spare. The other had been the craft room I'd set up after Harold passed somewhere to paint, to sew, to keep my hands busy when the silence got too loud. I gave them the childhood room. I converted the craft room to a sitting area so they'd have somewhere of their own. I moved my sewing machine to the corner of my bedroom and told myself it would be fine. It was not fine. With 6 adults in a 4-bedroom house, the territory questions became unavoidable. Who used which bathroom? Who stored what in the refrigerator? Whose schedule took precedence in the kitchen in the morning? These are the small wars that erode households, and they erode the weakest parties the fastest. I was one person against 3 who all shared the same interests. I started eating breakfast earlier to avoid the morning crowding. I started timing my showers around everyone else's schedule. I started watching my programs in my bedroom instead of the living room, because the living room had quietly become Lauren's space, decorated with her preferences, arranged for her comfort. I was a guest in my own home, and I didn't have a name for it yet. The morning I came back from my doctor's appointment, just a routine check, my blood pressure had been high, and I'd been monitoring it. I found Diane sitting at my kitchen table, reading a magazine and drinking from my good coffee mug, the ceramic one with the blue stripe that Harold had given me years ago. That wasn't what stopped me cold. What stopped me was that the door at the end of the hallway, the door to my bedroom, was open, and there were voices inside. I walked down that hallway slowly. I remember the feel of the hardwood under my feet, how familiar it was, how my feet knew every board that creaked and automatically shifted weight to avoid them the way they had for decades. I stood in the doorway of my own bedroom, and I saw Lauren directing her father as he moved my dresser to the far wall. "What is happening?" I asked. Lauren turned around. She had the expression of someone who'd prepared for this moment and was ready to deliver her lines. "Mom," she said, she'd taken to calling me that without ever asking whether I welcomed it, I've been thinking. And honestly, this room is just so much bigger. Frank's knees have been bad, and it's hard for him to manage the stairs, and your room is on the ground floor. "This is my bedroom," I said. "And we were thinking you could use the garage space. Nathan's already working on making it comfortable. There's a bed out there, and we can put up a space heater." "Lauren." My voice came out very quiet. I hadn't intended that. I'd intended something much larger. But it came out quiet the way things sometimes do when the shock hasn't turned to anger yet. "Are you telling me you're moving me out of my bedroom and putting me in the garage?" "Just temporary," she said. And there was that word again. Temporary. The word they'd been using for everything since the day they arrived. "Where's Nathan?" I asked. "He's at work, Mom. Look, we can talk about this when." "Where is my son?" She pulled out her phone and typed something. A moment passed. "Then he says he'll be home by 7, and we can all sit down and—" I turned around. I walked back down the hallway. I picked up my purse from the hook by the door. I walked out to the porch, and I sat in the wicker chair Harold used to read in on summer evenings, and I stared out at the oak tree in the front yard, the one I'd planted when it was a stick with 3 leaves, and I sat there for a very long time. The rage that was building inside me wasn't the kind that explodes. It was the kind that calcifies, the kind that turns something soft and trusting into something unbreakable. I could feel it happening, cell by cell, like a change in weather you sense before you see the clouds. By the time Nathan came home at 7:15, I was still sitting on the porch. He had the decency to look ashamed when he saw me there. He sat in Harold's chair and he said, "Mom, I'm sorry. I should have called you before." "Did you know?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. "Nathan, did you know she planned to move me to the garage?" I knew she was thinking about rearranging. "That's a yes," I said. "Mom, Frank's knee is really—" "I don't care about Frank's knee," I said, and my voice finally had some of the weight I'd meant it to have. "I care that my son allowed his wife to evict his mother from her bedroom in the home his mother owns. I care that you sat at this office all day knowing what was happening here, and you did not call me. I care about that, Nathan." He looked at his hands. He looked like he was 12 years old, and he'd broken something he couldn't fix. "It's just until they find a better situation," he said. I looked at him, really looked at him, and I saw something I hadn't let myself see before. I saw that he was not going to fix this. He was not going to stand up and say enough. He loved me. I believed that, but he was weak in the specific way that some men are weak, the way that makes them choose peace with the person in front of them over justice for the person they believe will absorb the cost. I had taught him to count on me to absorb the cost. That was my failure too. I had been absorbing costs my whole life and calling it love. "All right," I said, "all right." He looked startled. "I'll sleep in the garage tonight," I said. "We'll talk more later." He exhaled in relief, and the relief on his face hurt me more than anything Lauren had done, because Lauren was a stranger at the end of it. Nathan was my boy, and he was relieved that I had agreed to sleep in my own garage so that his in-laws could have my room. I went inside, son. I gathered my pillow, my blanket, my medication from the nightstand, and Harold's anniversary photograph. I carried them down the hallway, past Diane in the kitchen, past the living room that no longer looked like mine, and out through the side door into the garage. I made up the narrow cot they'd put there. I lay down on it in the cold. I listened to the sounds of my house footsteps above me, a television, laughter from the kitchen, and I stared up at Harold's pegboard with its silhouettes of missing tools. And I made a decision. Not out loud, not with ceremony. Just a quiet turning, the way a key turns in a lock. I was done absorbing the cost. I didn't sleep that first night. Not really. I drifted in and out of something that felt less like sleep and more like standing at the edge of a dark room, aware of everything around me but unable to fully enter or leave. The cot they'd set up was narrow, a camping cot, the fold-up kind with aluminum legs that made small creaking sounds every time I shifted my weight. The space heater Nathan had plugged in for me ticked and hummed, but never quite pushed the cold out of the corners. Harold's garage had always been a cold space. He used to joke that it was the only room in the house that kept its own opinions about temperature. I lay there and I listened to the house. Houses have sounds at night that you only learn after years of living inside them. I knew this house the way I knew my own heartbeat, the particular groan of the third step on the staircase, the way the pipes in the wall behind the bathroom ticked when the hot water ran, the low hum of the refrigerator that shifted pitch slightly whenever the compressor cycled. I had been listening to those sounds for 40 years, and they had always meant home. That night they meant something different. They meant that the house was still running, still breathing, still doing what houses do, but for people who were not me. Above me, I could hear footsteps moving through the rooms, the muffled sound of a television, a burst of laughter from somewhere toward the kitchen, Frank's voice low and satisfied. And I lay in the dark on a camping cot with Harold's old pegboard on the wall above me, and I thought, with a clarity that surprised me, how did I get here? Not as a question exactly, more as an accounting. A line drawn in the dark, and everything placed on one side or the other. I had given them everything. I had handed over my home, my space, my schedule, my quiet, my kitchen, my routines. I had handed it over piece by piece the way you let a tide take things from the shore, telling yourself each piece is small. Each piece doesn't matter. Just let it go. It isn't worth the fight. And now I was in the garage. Sleeping in the garage I owned, in the house I owned, on a street I'd lived on for 40 years, while strangers rearranged my belongings in my bedroom upstairs. The thing nobody tells you about being a widow is that it makes you vulnerable in ways you don't expect. It's not just loneliness, though that's real enough. It's that you lose the person who stood beside you, and without them you are a single point, and a single point is easier to move. Harold would not have let this happen. Not because he would have been aggressive or confrontational. Harold was the gentlest man I have ever known, but because he would have noticed sooner. He would have turned to me one evening and said quietly, "This isn't right," and that would have been enough. Two people hold the line together. One person holds it alone, and sometimes the line moves. I'd let the line move too many times, but lying there in the dark that first night, I made a promise to myself. Not a dramatic one, not a speech. Just a quiet internal reckoning, the kind that comes when you've finally had enough, and you know it all the way down to the floor of yourself. I was not going to be moved again, and I was not going to fight the way they expected me to fight loudly, emotionally, in a way they could dismiss or work around. I was going to be very, very still, and I was going to watch. The second morning, I woke early, well before anyone else was moving. I used the small bathroom off the garage that Harold had installed years ago. For when he was working on projects, it had a toilet and a sink, and barely enough room to turn around in, but it was functional. I washed my face in cold water, dressed in the dim light coming through the small high window, and then I sat in the old camping chair Harold had kept out there, and I began making a list. Not on paper, not yet, in my head where no one could find it. I listed every change that had happened in the 14 months since Nathan and Lauren had moved in. I listed the furniture that had been rearranged, the items that had been boxed up or moved without my permission, the decisions that had been made about my home, which rooms would be used by whom, how the refrigerator would be organized, whose mail sat on the entryway table and whose was stacked in a corner. I listed every conversation where I had said something small and true and been talked past. Every meal where I had sat at my own dining table and felt like a visitor at someone else's gathering. The list was longer than I wanted it to be. That was its own kind of knowledge. When I heard Diane's alarm go off upstairs, she had a clock that beeped 3 times, and then went quiet. I got up and went into the main house before she reached the kitchen. Kitchen was still mine in name. I put the coffee on, and I stood at the window over the sink, and I looked out at my backyard, at the oak tree that was just beginning to bud, despite the season still being cold, and I breathed in and I breathed out, and I was still there when Lauren came downstairs 20 minutes later in her robe, and her expression of mild, practiced surprise at finding me already in the kitchen. "Oh," she said, "you're up early." "I'm always up early," I said. This was true. Lauren had lived in my house for over a year, and she did not know this about me. She poured herself a coffee and leaned against the counter and watched me in a way I had noticed, before the way someone watches a problem. They're deciding whether it's the right moment to address. She had a talent for timing. Lauren did. She never pushed when she thought you might push back. She waited until you were off balance. How was the garage? She asked. The casualness of it was, I think, the cruelest part. Cold, I said. I kept my voice even. I kept my back to her and watched the oak tree. Nathan said he's going to get a better heater. Is he? Pause. I heard her set down her mug. Evelyn. Her voice shifted slightly, taking on that tone she used when she was about to reframe something. I know this isn't ideal, but Frank's knee surgery is scheduled for next month, and he genuinely cannot do the stairs. Once he recovers, we can look at rearranging again. Lauren, I said, and I turned around. I looked at her, all the way at her, and I made sure she could see that I was not confused or hurt or wavering. I kept my expression clean and my voice level. I want you to hear me very clearly. I have not agreed to this arrangement. I have not agreed to anything. I am sleeping in the garage tonight because I chose not to fight about it last night, not because I accept it as permanent. Opened her mouth. I kept talking. And I want you to think very carefully about the decisions you're making in this house. Because it is my house, my name on the deed, my property taxes. My 40 years of mortgage payments that are now finished and done because Harold and I paid every last one of them together. I paused. I'm going to get some breakfast now. I turned back to the stove. My hands were steady. I was proud of that. Lauren said nothing. She took her coffee and she left the kitchen, and I listened to her footsteps on the stairs. And I stood there and I scrambled my eggs with the kind of focused attention you give to a task when you are using it to keep the rest of yourself under control. It wasn't a victory, I knew that, but it was the end of my silence. The first thing I discovered, about a week after moving into the garage, was an accident. I was looking for the box of Harold's tools that I'd moved to a shelf in the garage when Lauren rearranged things. I wanted a specific screwdriver to fix the latch on my cot, and in moving boxes around, I knocked a large manila envelope off the top of a plastic bin. It fell and the contents slid out across the concrete floor. I almost just gathered them up and put them back, but the paper that landed closest to my feet had the word renovation printed across the top in large letters, and below it, in smaller text, a subtitle that made me crouch down slowly and pick it up. It was a document, several pages, printed on regular paper, held together at the corner with a binder clip. It appeared to be a layout plan, hand-sketched in some places and typed up in others for changes to the house. Room assignments, descriptions of purposes, a rough cost estimate for what looked like structural work. I carried it to the camping chair and I read every page. The renovation plan was, as best as I could understand it, Lauren's. Her name was in the header, along with a date from 2 months prior 2 months, which meant she'd been planning this while still performing gratitude, still thanking me at family dinners, still calling me Mom with that particular warmth she deployed like a tool. It outlined a vision for the house. Nathan and Lauren's bedroom, currently the master guest room, would remain as is in the short term. Frank and Diane's room, currently my bedroom, was to be expanded by opening a doorway into the adjacent craft space, creating what the document called a primary suite for longer-term guests. The plan included notes about the downstairs bathroom, and a note in Lauren's handwriting in the margin. Check zoning for addition. Backyard has clearance. And then I got to the page that described the garage. The garage was labeled, in Lauren's own printed words, as the permanent independent living space, Evelyn. There was a small sketch of the layout as she envisioned it. Bed space, a sitting area, a note about the existing half-bathroom being adequate for one occupant. Another margin note, separate entrance already exists, no need for house access modification. Permanent, independent, living space. I read those words 4 times. She had planned this before Frank and Diane even moved in. She had designed this before Nathan's story about Frank's knee had even been told. The knee surgery, the reason that had been given for moving me out of my bedroom, that was not a reason at all. It was a justification assembled after the decision had already been made. A costume for something uglier underneath. My hands were not as steady now. I sat in that camping chair in the garage that was already being designated as my permanent home by a woman who had arrived 14 months ago with boxes and a casserole and the word temporarily on her lips, and I felt something I had not felt in a very long time. It was not simple anger. It was something deeper and older and more absolute than anger. It was the feeling of seeing the full shape of something you'd been living inside without being able to see its edges. They were not staying with me. They were taking over from me. and they had planned it that way. I folded the document carefully, put it inside my pillowcase, which was the only truly private space I had. And I lay back on the narrow cot, and I stared at Harold's pegboard, and I thought about what I was going to do. Over the following 2 weeks, I became a very good observer. I had always been reasonably attentive. You don't raise a child alone for stretches of time while your husband works long hours and remain inattentive to the world around you. This was different. This was the specific, focused attention of a woman who has realized she has been underestimated and who has decided to use that underestimation. They did not expect me to look closely. Lauren, particularly, had decided I was the kind of woman who could be managed through comfort and routine given a small space, given enough assurance that things were temporary, and left to adjust. She smiled at me more in those 2 weeks, brought me tea in the evenings, asked about my health with what sounded like warmth. She was managing me. She thought it was working. What she did not know was that I was keeping a notebook. I had found an old composition book in a box of Nathan's school things I'd never thrown away. The kind with the black and white marbled cover that I used to buy 6 at a time when he started each school year. Kept it at the bottom of my bag, under my wallet and my extra reading glasses, and the pill organizer my doctor had told me to use. Every day I wrote down what I observed. Not dramatically, just facts. Dates and times, conversations I'd witnessed or been part of, decisions that had been made about the house without my knowledge or input, items that had been moved, changes that had been implemented. I was building a record. I didn't know exactly what I would do with it yet, but I knew that in disputes, real disputes, the kind that end up in front of other people, the person with the documentation wins. What I was gathering slowly was proof that I had not been a willing participant in what was happening to me. The changes had been made without my consent, that there was a plan, and the plan had never included me as anything other than an obstacle to be accommodated as cheaply as possible. I also began paying very close attention to the mail. The mail had been one of the first small shifts Lauren had mentioned, that it made more sense for her to manage incoming mail, since she was handling so much of the household coordination. And I had, in one of my earlier, more passive moments, not objected. But I began arriving at the mailbox before she did. I began opening my own mail, obviously, but I also noticed what came for Nathan, and more importantly, what Nathan left on the kitchen counter, and then left again, and then sometimes left a third time without opening. Nathan, I was realizing, had stopped paying attention to his own life. He was present in the house the way a piece of furniture is present, occupying space, familiar, background. He worked. He came home. He ate what Lauren put on the table. He watched the television programs Lauren selected. He did not, as far as I could observe, make a single autonomous decision about anything in that house. When I tried to talk to him, really talk to him, not the surface conversations we'd been having, he deflected with tiredness, with busyness, with a kind of ambient apology that was meant to substitute for actual accountability. Mom, I know things aren't perfect right now. Nathan, did you know that Lauren has a plan that labels the garage as my permanent residence? Pause. We were standing in the backyard, him with a cup of coffee, me near the garden bed I'd been trying to tend. He looked at me with something that was not quite surprise and not quite guilt. Something in between. I know she's been thinking about long-term arrangements. Long-term, I said. Lauren's plan uses the word permanent. Mom, she put it in writing. She made a sketch of the layout. She wrote notes about the separate entrance, so I wouldn't need access to the main house. I let that land. That's not temporary, Nathan. That's permanent. And you knew she was thinking about it. He looked away toward the oak tree. He had his father's jaw and his father's eyes, and in that moment the resemblance was painful in a particular way, because Harold would never, not for a single second, have stood in this yard looking at that tree instead of looking at me. I thought we could find a compromise, Nathan said. A compromise, I repeated. A compromise between what and what exactly? Between me having my bedroom and me living in the garage? That compromise would be what? The hallway? He almost laughed. I could see it flicker across his face, the instinct toward humor that he'd always used when something was too uncomfortable to face straight on. Caught it and put it away. I'll talk to her, he said. I've heard that before, I said. I turned back to my garden. You don't have to talk to her about anything on my account, Nathan. I'm handling it. He didn't ask what I meant. He should have asked. But he took the exit I'd given him and went back inside, and I stayed in the yard, and I thought about the phone call I needed to make. Her name was Patricia Osi, and she was the attorney who had handled Harold's estate when he passed. She had a small practice in town, mostly family law and estate matters, and she had been thorough and kind through a process that had felt overwhelming. And I had kept her number in my phone ever since, because Harold always said to keep the numbers of people who've proven themselves to you. Called her from the backyard, with the gate closed behind me, so I was out on the narrow side path beside the house, the one between the fence and the foundation where nobody ever went, because there was nothing there except the electrical meter and an old rain barrel Harold had used for the garden. She remembered me. She asked about my health. I told her I was fine, and then I told her what had happened. I told her everything, the gradual changes, the garage, the renovation plan with my bedroom, marked as a permanent suite for Lauren's parents, and the garage marked as my permanent independent living space. I read her the exact words from the document. There was a silence on the other end. "Evelyn," Patricia said, "do you still have that document?" "Yes." "Do you have it somewhere safe? Somewhere no one in the house has access?" "It's in my bag." "Good. Keep it there. Do not let it out of your possession." Another pause. "I want you to come see me. Can you do that this week without drawing attention? I have a doctor's appointment Thursday morning. Come by my office Thursday afternoon. 2:00. "Patricia, I'm not sure yet what I want to do. I don't have a plan." "You don't need a plan yet," she said. "You just need to understand your options. And, Evelyn, I need you to hear this very clearly." Her voice was careful, the way people are careful when they're about to say something that matters. That is your home, your property. Regardless of who is living in it or what arrangements have been made informally, the legal standing is yours. No one can change that without your knowledge and consent. "I know," I said. "Do you?" Because sometimes people in situations like yours start to forget. They're told temporary so many times that they start to believe they are the ones without standing. You have more legal standing in that house than anyone else living there. All of them combined. I stood in the narrow side path with the cold concrete foundation behind me and the fence in front of me, and I held the phone and I said, "I know that. I just needed to hear someone else say it." "I'm saying it," Patricia said. 2:00 Thursday. The conversation with Patricia changed something. Not because she told me anything I didn't know, but because saying it out loud to another person, to a professional who listened with pen in hand and neutral attention, transformed the reality of it from something personal and shameful into something concrete and addressable. I had been carrying what was happening to me as though it were my own fault, as though allowing it had made me complicit in it, as though the shame of being an old woman being walked over in her own home was mine to hold. It wasn't mine. I put it down in Patricia's office on a Thursday afternoon while rain hit the windows and her assistant brought in a small tray of tea, and I felt the specific relief of a burden being formally recognized as a burden and not just a private failing. Patricia laid out what I already knew legally but needed to hear arranged in orderly terms. The house was mine. It had been mine before Harold passed, and it was mine after, clearly deeded, no complications. Nathan had no claim to it. Lauren had no claim to it. Frank and Diane had certainly no claim to it. Nothing that had been done informally, no verbal agreements, no casual rearrangements of rooms, changed that underlying reality. "The renovation plan," Patricia said, sliding her glasses up her nose and looking at the document I'd brought her. "This is in Lauren's name? Her name and the date are in the header. And you found it in the garage. In your garage. On top of one of the bins." Patricia made a note. She may argue it was a casual brainstorm, not an actionable plan. "She wrote structural modification estimates," I said. "She has margin notes about zoning and building permits." Patricia looked at me over her glasses. "Yes," she said. She did. She made another note. "Evelyn, what is it that you actually want? Not legally, not procedurally, what do you want?" It was the right question, and it was harder than it sounded. I thought about it carefully. "I don't want to fight," I said. "I'm too old for fighting. What I want is my life back. The life I had in that house. The dignity of being in my own home on my own terms." I paused. "But I think I might be past the point where that's recoverable. I think too much has happened. So what do you want instead?" "I want to not be powerless," I said. "Whatever I decide to do, I want it to be my decision. I want to make a move instead of waiting to see what move they make next." Patricia nodded slowly. She set down her pen. Then let's talk about your options. We talked for 2 hours. By the time I left, the rain had stopped, and the light was doing the thing it does in early spring. Thin and gold, landing on wet surfaces and turning them briefly luminous. I walked to my car, and I sat inside, and I didn't start the engine right away. I sat there, and I thought about Harold. I thought about the 44 years, and the house and the oak tree, and the pottery figurines Lauren had boxed up and put in storage. I thought about the photograph on the nightstand that I'd brought to the garage with me, the one from our anniversary. Both of us squinting into the sun. I thought about what he would say if he could see what had happened. Not what he would say to Nathan or Lauren. What he would say to me. And I knew, as clearly as I'd known anything, that he would say, "Ev, you always knew what to do. You just have to let yourself do it." I started the car. I drove home to my garage. But that night, lying on the narrow cot with the heater ticking and the house sounds above me, I wasn't staying still anymore. Inside my head, I was moving. I was planning. I was making calculations that no one in that house would have believed me capable of, because they had made the oldest and most costly mistake that people make when they decide to underestimate someone. They had mistaken my patience for weakness. They had mistaken my quiet for acceptance. They had mistaken my love for my son for an inability to protect myself. Lauren had her renovation plan with her neat little sketch of my permanent garage space. I had Patricia Osi, 2 hours of legal consultation, and a composition notebook full of documented facts. Let them make their next move. I was done waiting to be surprised by it. Whatever came next in that house, I would be the one deciding what it meant and what it cost not them. They thought they were managing an old woman who had run out of options. They had no idea that the most consequential decision of all of their lives was already being quietly, carefully assembled without their knowledge. The days after my meeting with Patricia had a particular quality that I struggled to name at first. They looked the same from the outside. I woke on the narrow cot, used the small bathroom, made my way into the kitchen before anyone else stirred, drank my coffee at the window, and watched the oak tree. I moved through the house the way I had been moving through it for weeks, careful and quiet, not drawing attention. Lauren continued bringing me tea in the evenings with that managed warmth she'd decided to maintain. Nathan continued arriving home, tired and eating dinner without quite looking at me. Frank sat in the armchair that had been Harold's and read his sports pages, and Diane reorganized my pantry shelves and called it helping. From the outside, nothing had changed. But inside me, something had shifted so completely that I was almost surprised the change wasn't visible. It was like the difference between standing on a frozen lake and not knowing the ice has cracked versus standing on the same lake and knowing exactly where every crack runs. The surface looks identical. The danger is the same. But you are an entirely different person, depending on which of those two things is true. I knew where the cracks ran. I had spent 2 hours with Patricia mapping every one of them. And now, when Lauren smiled at me over the dinner table, I was not a confused old woman trying to understand why her home felt wrong. I was a property owner in the process of making a decision. Those are two very different things to be, and only one of them has any power at all. The first thing Patricia had asked me to do was gather my documents. Not legal documents, those she already had copies of from Harold's estate process. She meant the physical records I kept in the house, the original deed, the insurance policies, the utility account paperwork, the old mortgage statements that showed the payoff, Harold's death certificate, the property tax receipts going back years. I had kept all of these in a fireproof lockbox that lived on the top shelf of my bedroom closet, the closet that was now in a bedroom occupied by Frank and Diane. This was the first practical problem. I waited until a Wednesday morning when Frank had a physical therapy appointment for his knee. The knee surgery had actually happened. I'll give Lauren that much. It was real if nothing else about her justifications had been, and Diane went with him the way Diane always went with Frank, as though he couldn't navigate a medical building without a guide. Nathan was at work. Lauren had what she called her business calls on Wednesday mornings, sitting at my kitchen table with her laptop and a headset, talking to clients in her event planning work. I knew her schedule better than she knew mine. That was one advantage of being underestimated. I went upstairs. The door to what had been my bedroom was closed. I opened it. The room had been rearranged in the weeks. Since Frank and Diane moved in, the dresser was against a different wall. A small television had been set up on the shelf where I'd kept my books. There was a medical walking aid leaning against the corner for Frank's knee recovery. The bed had different linens on it. The nightstand had Frank's reading glasses and Diane's hand cream and a glass of water. My lockbox was still on the top shelf of the closet, pushed toward the back. They hadn't touched it. Whether that was because they hadn't noticed it or because they'd decided it wasn't worth the confrontation, I couldn't say. I got it down with some effort. It was heavier than I remembered, and I carried it to the garage, and I put it in the bottom of my duffel bag, under my extra sweater. I stood there for a moment in the middle of the room that had been mine for 4 decades, surrounded by other people's things. On the wall, there was still a small nail hole, from where I'd hung the oval mirror I'd had since our first apartment. Everything else of mine was gone, replaced or rearranged or boxed, and stored somewhere that was convenient for someone other than me. I left the room. I closed the door behind me. I didn't let myself feel it, not fully, because if I let myself feel it fully, I would not be useful to myself. I would just be a woman standing in a hallway, crying about a nail hole. And that woman couldn't do what needed to be done. I went back to the garage, and I opened the lockbox, and I checked everything inside. Deed, insurance documents, tax records, mortgage payoff letter, Harold's death certificate, my own identification. Everything in order, everything where it had always been, because I had always been a careful woman, even when carefulness was the only power I had. I took photographs of each document with my phone. Then I emailed those photographs to Patricia and to my own email address and to a secondary email account I'd created for this specific purpose, one that no one else knew about, on a browser I'd never used on any device that connected to the household internet. I drove to the library to create that account, using the library's Wi-Fi, because Patricia had mentioned carefully, without being dramatic about it, that it was wise to keep certain communications off any network shared with others in the household. I was becoming a different kind of careful than I had ever been in my life. Patricia had given me several options to consider. She had laid them out the way a doctor lays out treatment plans, factual, clear, without pressure toward any particular choice, but honest about what each one meant in practice. The first option was a formal written notice to Nathan and Lauren, drafted by Patricia, establishing my terms for their continued residence, a defined timeline, specific conditions, a clear statement of my ownership and authority over the property. This would be a declaration, essentially, a line drawn. Patricia said it had a reasonable chance of prompting a genuine conversation and possibly a real resolution, but it also had a good chance of accelerating conflict, particularly given what the renovation plan suggested about Lauren's intentions. The second option was to consult a real estate professional about the property's current value and what a sale might look like, purely informationally, as a way of understanding the full range of what was possible. Patricia emphasized this was just information, not commitment. You don't have to do anything with the number except know it. The third option was doing nothing and continuing to observe, which Patricia presented without judgment, but which she also said gently, carried its own risks. The longer an informal arrangement continues, in certain jurisdictions, the more complicated extraction can become. Not legally, my ownership was not in question, but practically. People develop entrenched positions, belongings accumulate, emotional stakes rise, and the person being disadvantaged by the arrangement is rarely the one who benefits from time passing. I had thanked her and told her I needed to think. I'd been thinking for 3 weeks since that conversation. And the thing about sustained, serious thinking is that it has a way of arriving at its own conclusions, independent of what you expected to decide. I'd started those 3 weeks believing I might want to reclaim the house, issue the formal notice, set the terms, make them leave, or make them behave. By the end of those 3 weeks, I understood something I hadn't let myself understand before. I didn't want the house back. I wanted my life back. And those were not the same thing. The house was saturated now. That was the word that kept coming to me. Saturated. Like a cloth that's been dipped in something, it can never quite wash out. Every room held a different version of the story of what had happened there. And the versions Lauren and Frank and Diane had added were not ones I could paint over or rearrange away. My bedroom would always be the room I'd been removed from. The kitchen would always be the kitchen, where Lauren had stood at my counter and told me I'd get used to it. The living room would always be the room that had become hers while I was still in it. Could take the house back, and it would still feel like the site of a humiliation. Harold had always said, and it was one of those things he said so often that I'd stopped hearing it as a statement and just absorbed it as background, that a home was whatever you made it. Not the structure, not the address, not the 40 years of mortgage payments. What you made it, the quality of the life inside. I had made a beautiful life in that house. And then I had allowed other people in, and I had not been vigilant, and the life I'd made had been crowded out, piece by piece, until I was sleeping in the garage of a house I owned. I could fight to reclaim the structure, or I could let the structure go and reclaim the life. The second one was the harder choice, in some ways. It felt like losing. It looked like losing. To people who didn't understand what I was doing, it would look like an old woman finally giving up and letting herself be pushed out. I had to make peace with how it would look, because the only opinion that mattered about my own life was mine. I called Patricia on a Tuesday evening in early April from my car, parked at the far end of the driveway with the engine running for warmth. I want to sell, I told her. A pause. Tell me your thinking, she said. So I told her. She listened without interrupting, which was something I had always appreciated about Patricia. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. This is completely within your rights, she said. And everything you've said makes sense. I want to make sure you've thought about the timeline, because once you instruct a listing agent and the property goes on the market, there is no easy way to do this quietly. Nathan and Lauren will find out, and they will need to make arrangements to leave. I know, I said, and you're prepared for that. I'm prepared to be the one who makes the decision, I said. For once, I'm going to make the decision. All right, Patricia said. Let me give you the name of someone. A real estate professional I trust. His name is Marcus Del Rey. He's handled estate sales and sensitive family property situations before. He will be discreet for as long as you need him to be. She gave me his number. I wrote it on the back of a gas station receipt I found in the cup holder. I thanked her. I sat in the car in the dark driveway for a moment longer, looking at the house through the windshield. The lights were on in the living room. I could see the blue flicker of the television through the curtains Lauren's program, whatever she was watching. In my bedroom window upstairs, the light was on, and a shadow moved behind the curtain. Diane getting ready for bed. My house. All its windows lit up with people who were not me. I put the car in drive and pulled out of the driveway, not because I was going anywhere in particular, but because I needed to be moving. I drove through the neighborhood I had lived in for 40 years, past the houses of people I knew, and the corners I had walked with Harold in the evenings, and I let myself feel, fully, what it meant to be choosing to leave. It felt like grief and like relief in equal measure, and I did not try to separate them. Marcus Del Rey had the specific manner of a person who had learned, through experience, how to be simultaneously professional and human, with people going through difficult things. He was a trim man in his 50s with reading glasses. He kept on a lanyard and a habit of asking one more question than you expected, the kind of question that turned out to be the right one. We met at his office on a Thursday afternoon, a different Thursday from my doctor's appointment cover story, this time telling no one where I was going because I had decided that I did not owe anyone in that house an accounting of my schedule. I drove there myself, and I sat across from his desk, and I told him the situation in plain terms. Property is paid off and clearly deeded in your name, he said. Not a question, confirming what Patricia had already shared with him. Yes. And the current occupants, your son and his wife, and her parents, they have no formal lease, no written rental agreement, nothing that constitutes a legal tenancy. Nothing. It was always understood as a temporary family arrangement. Marcus made a note. That's actually straightforward on the legal side. The complication is always the human side. He looked at me steadily. Are you prepared for the conflict? Because there will be conflict. There's already conflict, I said. I'm just not the one currently generating it. I'd like to change that. He almost smiled. Understood. He pulled out a folder. Let me show you what the market looks like right now on Sycamore Lane. What the market looked like was considerably better than I'd expected. The neighborhood had appreciated significantly over the past 5 years. This was not something I'd been tracking because I hadn't been thinking about selling. The house, based on comparable recent sales on nearby streets, would list in a range that Marcus described as strong, which was a professional way of saying a number That surprised me enough that I had to look at the paper twice. That's what similar properties have sold for, he said. Your house has the advantage of the lot size, the mature landscaping, the structural condition, and it's fully paid off, which means the entire proceeds come to you. I thought about what that number meant. I thought about it in practical terms, where I could live, what I could afford, what kind of life I could build in a space that was actually mine. A smaller house, something manageable, with a garden, somewhere I could have my things around me and eat my breakfast when I wanted to eat it, and watch my programs in my own living room without feeling like an intruder. How long from listing to close, I asked, if we price it right? In this market for a property in this condition? If we list it properly, 60 days to close is conservative. Could be faster. And what's the process before listing? What do I need to do? He walked me through it. I took notes. Not in my composition notebook, I'd brought a fresh notepad because this conversation deserved its own record separate from the observational log I'd been keeping. By the time I left his office 2 hours later, I had a clear picture of what the next several weeks would need to look like, and who would be involved, and what each step would require of me. I drove home. I parked in the driveway. I sat in the car for a minute, and I looked at the house one more time. The way you look at a thing when you're beginning to practice seeing it as something you used to have rather than something you have. Then I went inside, and I went to the garage, and I sat in the camping chair, and I opened my fresh notepad, and I made a timeline. The hardest part was the waiting. Not because I was uncertain, I had moved past uncertainty into something quieter and more resolved. The hardest part was that I had to keep performing the role of the diminished woman while simultaneously making arrangements that would change everything for everyone in that house. I had to sit at the dinner table and answer Lauren's questions about whether I'd eaten enough and whether the garage was warm enough, and smile and say yes, fine, thank you. I had to watch Nathan move through his days in that specific fog of avoidance he'd perfected. I had to see Frank in Harold's armchair and Diane in my kitchen and not let a single thing show on my face. I was not a deceptive person by nature. That was the honest truth. In my marriage, in my friendships, in every relationship I'd valued, I'd been direct to a fault. Harold used to say I had no poker face whatsoever, that every opinion I had was written on my face in clear handwriting. But this was different. This was not deception for its own sake. This was self-protection. This was the protective camouflage of a woman who had learned, too late, that showing her hand while others concealed theirs was not honesty. It was vulnerability masquerading as virtue. So I waited, and I watched, and I gathered what I needed. Marcus needed several things from me before listing. An updated property survey. There was an older one on file, but he wanted a current one given the property's age. A disclosure document about the property's condition. Professional walkthrough with a home inspector whose findings would be part of the sale package for buyers. Each of these things required scheduling people to come to the house, and scheduling people to come to the house required having windows when the house would be accessible, without requiring an explanation to its current occupants. I managed it in pieces. The surveyor came on a morning when I told Lauren I was expecting a delivery and would need to be home for it. The surveyor was quick and professional and required no access to the interior. The home inspector I scheduled for a day when Nathan was at work, and Lauren had what she'd told me was an all-day off-site with one of her event planning clients. Frank had a follow-up appointment with his surgeon that same day, and Diane went with him. I had the house to myself for 4 hours. Those 4 hours were surreal. The inspector walked through every room, my bedroom, Nathan and Lauren's room, the living room, the kitchen, all of it, methodically, with his clipboard and his flashlight and his professional detachment. And I followed behind him and thought, this is still my house. Every wall, every pipe, every creaking step, mine. Good bones, the inspector said. In the kitchen, knocking lightly on the wall near the window. Well maintained for its age. Roof looks like it was replaced fairly recently. 7 years ago, I said. Good HVAC serviced every year. He nodded and made a note. You've taken care of this place. I have, I said. And there was something in my voice when I said it that made him look up from his clipboard, something that must have been more than a statement of fact, because he gave me a look that was briefly and unexpectedly human. Ready to let it go? He asked. Not prying. Just the question a person asks when they sense a person is on the edge of something. Getting there, I said. Getting there. The week after the inspection, I found out they knew something was happening. About the sale, they didn't know that, couldn't have known it. I had been careful to a degree that would have seemed extreme in any other situation, but felt entirely proportionate in this one. But they knew something had shifted in me. Lauren, particularly, had the specific antennae of a person who manages situations for a living, who watches people the way predators watch territorial boundaries, and she had noticed something in my manner that she couldn't name but couldn't ignore. Started on a Wednesday evening. I was in the garage when I heard the door open, not the side door from the house, but the main garage door that connected to the driveway. Lauren came in. She didn't knock. Of course she didn't knock. In her mental architecture, this was not a space that required knocking. She looked around the garage with a surveying expression, calculating, cataloging. Then she looked at me, sitting in the camping chair with my notepad, which I closed unhurriedly and set face down on my lap. "Am I interrupting?" she asked, which was a question she was asking for form's sake, not because the answer would change anything. "What can I do for you, Lauren?" She came in and stood near the shelf, where Harold's remaining tools were hung, her arms crossed, her weight shifted in the particular way she stood when she was about to manage something. "I wanted to check in," she said. "You've seemed distant this week." "I'm fine," I said. "Are you upset about something?" I looked at her. In that moment, I felt the full, strange weight of what I was carrying and what she didn't know, and it was not a triumphant feeling. It was complicated, because she was a real person, whatever she had done. And Nathan was my son. And even now, even here, I was capable of feeling the complexity of it, rather than the clean certainty of a villain's plot. "Lauren," I said, "why are you here? Not in this garage right now. In this house. Why are you still here?" She blinked. "What do you mean? We live here. You've been telling me since the day you arrived that your situation is temporary. You and Nathan are getting back on your feet. Your finances are stabilizing." I watched her face. "Nathan mentioned to me 2 weeks ago that his commission numbers have been improving." Something flickered behind her eyes. "These things take time," she started. "How long?" I asked. "I'm not asking to be difficult. I genuinely want to understand. Do you have a number? A month? A target? A plan with a date on it?" She was quiet, and in her quiet I heard the answer, which was that there was no plan. There had never been a plan. The plan was Lauren's renovation document. Plan was a permanent, independent living space with a separate entrance. Plan was the house, permanently with me in it, only as a manageable complication. "I think we both know," I said, "that the arrangement here has moved a long way from what was described when you arrived. And I think we both know that it keeps moving." I kept my voice even. Kept my hand still. "I want you to think about that. Evelyn." That's all I wanted to say tonight. I picked up my notepad and opened it again, looking back at my notes. "Good night, Lauren." She stood there for another moment. I could feel her trying to find the right angle, the right thing to say, that would reassert her management of the situation. She didn't find it. She went back inside and closed the door. I waited until I heard her footsteps cross through the kitchen and up the stairs. Then I sat in the quiet garage with Harold's pegboard on the wall and the night sounds of the neighborhood coming faintly through the walls, and I let out a long, slow breath. The next morning, I called Marcus Del Rey. "I'm ready to move forward," I told him. "Let's set the listing date." He was ready. He had been waiting for my call. We set a timeline 3 weeks to prepare the final documentation, have the professional photographs taken, finalize the listing price, and file everything that needed to be filed. Property would go live on the market on a Friday morning in late May. "People living in the house," Marcus said carefully. "When are you planning to inform them?" "When everything is finalized," I said. "Not before." A pause. "That's your right," he said. "Yes," I said, "it is." What Marcus meant, and what I understood, was that there was a version of this where I told Nathan in advance, where I sat him down, showed him what I'd decided, gave him time to prepare. A gentler version. A version where I extended to him a courtesy he had not extended to me when his wife moved me into the garage. I had thought about that version. I had given it serious consideration because Nathan was my son, and no matter what had happened, that was real, and it mattered, and it made things hurt in ways that Lauren's choices could not. But I thought about the night Nathan came home and found me on the porch, and I asked him directly if he'd known, and he hedged. I thought about his face when I said I'd sleep in the garage, the relief on his face, and what that relief had cost me to witness. I thought about every conversation where I'd given him an opening to do the right thing, and he'd chosen the easier path. He'd had his chances, not just once, not just twice. He'd had them strung together over 14 months, a long rope of moments where he could have turned things around. And each time he had let the moment pass, because turning things around would have required a confrontation with Lauren that he wasn't willing to have. I had no cruelty in me toward him. That was true. I loved my son. But loving someone does not require absorbing unlimited cost on their behalf, and protecting someone from consequences does not teach them that consequences exist. Nathan needed to learn something. He needed to learn it in a way that staying comfortable in that house would never teach him. So I would tell him when the papers were done, when there was nothing left to negotiate or delay or manage around, when the decision had already been made by the person whose decision it was to make. By the time that Friday in May arrived, the only thing left for them to do would be to decide what they were going to do next. That was more choice than they had given me. Patricia called me on a Thursday 2 weeks into the final preparation period to confirm that all the paperwork on her end was in order. We talked through the details, what would happen at closing, how the proceeds would be handled, what my obligations were as seller. Then, at the end of the conversation, she said something that stayed with me. "Evelyn, how are you doing? Not the legal process, you. How are you actually doing?" I thought about it honestly, the way I tried to think about most things now. "I'm scared," I said, which surprises me. I've made the decision and I'm sure of it, but I'm still scared. "That's normal," she said. I don't know the right word for it. Not happy, not exactly, but solid. The way you feel when you've been standing on uncertain ground for a long time, and you finally find something firm under your feet. "That sounds right," Patricia said. "Solid is good. Solid holds." "I keep thinking about Harold," I said. "About what he'd think. What do you land on?" I was quiet for a moment, and then I said, "He'd probably say I let it go on too long. But he wouldn't say it unkindly." I paused. He'd say, "There she is." Finally, Patricia said nothing for a moment. Then, quietly, "There she is." I drove home. I parked in the driveway. I looked at the house in the afternoon light, the way the sun hit the front porch and caught the windows, the way the oak tree threw its particular shadow across the lawn. I looked at it with full knowledge of everything that had happened inside it, and everything that was about to happen. And I sat with the complexity of it, the love, and the grief, and the anger and the resolve, all of it real, none of it canceling the others out. Then I went to the garage. I made my bed for the night. I set Harold's photograph on the small surface. I'd cleared for it, the anniversary picture, both of us squinting into the sun. I looked at him for a long moment. 3 weeks, I told him silently. 3 weeks, and this is over. Above me, I could hear the house, the footsteps, the television, the sounds of people living inside a life they thought was secured and permanent and already decided. They had no idea what morning was coming. The 3 weeks passed the way the final stretch of a long wait always passes slowly, and then suddenly, with a quality of unreality at the end, as though time had been building pressure behind a door, and then the door opened all at once. I had not slept well the night before. That was the honest truth of it. I had lain on my narrow cot and stared at Harold's pegboard and run through the coming morning in my head. Not out of doubt, the doubt was gone. Had been gone for weeks, but out of the specific sleeplessness that comes when you are about to do something that cannot be undone. I was not afraid of the decision. I was afraid of the faces. Nathan's face particularly. That was the thing I kept circling back to in the dark, the thing I could not fully prepare for, no matter how many times I rehearsed it. I could manage Lauren. I could manage Frank and Diane. But Nathan's face was going to cost me something, and I knew it, and I had decided the cost was worth paying. And knowing that did not make the paying easier. I got up at 5:30. The house was completely still. I dressed carefully, not in the careless way I'd been dressing in the garage, pulling on whatever was nearest in the dim light. I wore the dark blue blouse that Harold had always liked, the one I'd brought to the garage in my first hurried gathering of necessities, and hung on a hook by the small window. I brushed my hair. I put on the small pearl earrings that had been my mother's. I looked in the small mirror propped on the shelf, like the person I was, a 72-year-old woman who had made up her mind. Marcus Del Rey arrived at 6:45, precisely when we'd agreed. He came in his car, a dark sedan, and behind him was a second car carrying 2 people from his office, a young woman named Claire who handled documentation, and a man named Robert who was there, as Marcus had quietly put it, for logistical support. He meant, without saying it directly, that he wanted a professional presence in case things became difficult. I met them in the driveway. The morning was cool and bright, the kind of May morning that feels like a promise before the day gets complicated. The sky that particular pale blue that means no rain. The oak tree was in full leaf, big and green, and exactly as I had always known it. "How are you feeling?" Marcus asked, shaking my hand. "Ready," I said, which was true as far as it went. He handed me a folder. Inside was the final set of documents, the signed sale agreement, the disclosure forms, the closing schedule. The property had gone under contract 10 days prior, faster than even Marcus had anticipated. The buyers were a young couple, mid-30s, expecting their first child. They had fallen in love with the lot size and the mature oak tree in the front yard and what the listing had described as decades of careful stewardship. They wanted to close quickly because they wanted to be settled before the baby came. It was, as these things sometimes are, a coincidence that felt almost too tidy, the house that had held a family for 40 years, passing to a new family just beginning. I had signed everything that needed signing over the previous days, in Patricia's office and in Marcus's office, and once, memorably, in my car in the library parking lot with a notary. Marcus had arranged to meet me there. The folder he handed me now was the complete record. Closing was scheduled for 11 days out. The house was, to all legal intents, sold. What remained was telling the people inside it. "Do you want us to wait out here?" Marcus asked. "No," I said. "Come in. In about 20 minutes I may need you." He nodded. I went inside. The kitchen was empty. Coffee maker Lauren's coffee maker, a sleek thing she'd replaced my old one with sometime in the fall, was already set on its timer, beginning to gurgle and hiss. I moved past it without turning it off. I walked through the kitchen and into the hallway, and I stood at the bottom of the stairs. "Nathan," I called. My voice came out steady and clear. "Lauren, I need everyone downstairs now. Silence." Then the specific sounds of people being woken, a groan, a shifting of weight, footsteps. Lauren appeared at the top of the stairs first. In her robe, her hair loose, her expression sharp, with the particular alertness of someone who has been waiting for a problem and thinks this might be it. Behind her, Nathan came out of their room squinting, still half asleep, one hand running through his hair. "Mom," he said, "what time is it?" "Early," I said. "Get Frank and Diane. Everyone in the living room, please." "Evelyn, what's going on?" Lauren's voice was already calibrated for management, the tone she used when she was trying to get ahead of a situation. "Living room," I said. 5 minutes. I walked into the living room and I sat in the chair by the window, the wicker chair from the porch that Lauren had moved inside months ago for Diane's use, which meant I was sitting in a chair that was mine, that had been repurposed for someone else, which felt, in its small way, entirely appropriate for this moment. Put the folder on my lap. I folded my hands on top of it. I waited. They came downstairs one at a time. Frank first, with his knee brace on, looking confused and slightly annoyed in the way of a man whose sleep has been interrupted without explanation. Diane behind him in a housecoat, her gray hair in a braid over one shoulder. Then Lauren, who had taken the 5 minutes to change out of her robe and into real clothes, which told me she understood it already, that this was not a casual conversation. And Nathan last, still in his pajama shirt and jeans he'd pulled on hastily, sitting on the couch next to Lauren and looking at me with an expression that was partly bewilderment and partly, I could see it there, underneath a low animal awareness that something significant was happening. Marcus knocked on the front door at that moment. I said, "Come in," loud enough to be heard, and the front door opened, and Marcus and Claire and Robert came into the entryway and stood there. Claire had her own folder. Robert stood with his hands at his sides and his face professionally neutral. Lauren's head snapped toward them. "Who are these people?" "This is Marcus Del Rey," I said. "He's a real estate professional." "Claire and Robert are from his office." The room went very still. Nathan was looking at Marcus, then at me, then at the folder on my lap. Something was moving across his face, the slow arrival of an understanding he was not ready for. "Mom," he said, "what did you do?" I opened the folder. I took out the top sheet, the sales summary, the one-page document that showed the property address, the agreed sale price, the closing date, the parties involved. "I've sold the house," I said. The silence lasted maybe 3 seconds. Then Lauren said, "What?" Not loudly, but with a quality of disbelief so complete, it almost sounded like a different word. The house is sold, I said again. The contract was signed 10 days ago. Closing is in 11 days. The buyers are a young couple who will be moving in approximately 30 days after closing, which gives everyone here 60 days from today to make alternative arrangements. Lauren stood up. You cannot be serious. I'm completely serious. This is our home. No, I said. I kept my voice even. I had practiced this, not the exact words, but the register, the calm, the clarity, the refusal to be moved by volume or accusation. This is my home. It has always been my home. My name alone on the deed. My mortgage payments, for 31 years, every single one of them. My property taxes. My insurance. Mine. You can't just sell it without telling us. Lauren, I looked at her directly. I did. Property owner does not require the approval or foreknowledge of people staying as informal guests. That is the legal reality. Frank made a sound from his chair somewhere between a cough and an objection. Diane put her hand on his arm. Evelyn, Diane said, and her voice was careful, the voice of a woman trying to find a path through something that has no good path. We have nowhere to go. Frank's recovery. I understand that's difficult, I said, and I'm sorry for the difficulty, genuinely. But I would ask you to consider that I also had nowhere to go when I was moved out of my bedroom with 4 hours' notice. I would ask you to consider that I have been sleeping in the garage for weeks. I paused. 60 days is more time than I was given. Frank's face had gone a particular color. Nathan had not spoken since his first question. He sat on the couch with his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands, and he was the one I kept watching in my peripheral vision, because he was the one that mattered to me, whatever happened with the rest of them. Lauren was reacting the way Lauren reacted to anything that challenged her control, loudly, rapidly, looking for the angle that would let her reframe it. Frank and Diane were collateral, innocent in their way, caught in something they'd benefited from without fully understanding what it was built on. But Nathan was my son, and whatever he said in the next few minutes would tell me something I needed to know about him. How much? Lauren demanded. She was standing in the middle of the room with her arms crossed and her jaw set. How much did you sell it for? That's not information I'm sharing with you, I said. You're splitting it with Nathan. I'm not splitting anything with anyone. The house is in my name. The proceeds belong to me. Nathan has no legal claim to this property and never has. He's your son, my son, I agreed. Not my co-owner. Lauren turned to Nathan. Nathan, say something. Tell her she can't do this. Nathan lifted his face from his hands. He looked at Lauren. Then he looked at me. His eyes were red at the edges, not from crying, from the stunned, sleepless quality of someone whose world has just reorganized itself without warning. Can she do this legally? He asked. Not me, he asked Marcus. Marcus, from the doorway, said quietly, yes. The property is in your mother's name. The sale is fully legal and properly executed. There is nothing to contest. Nathan nodded slowly. He looked at his hands for a moment, and then he said, okay, just that, okay. Lauren stared at him. Okay? That's what you're going to say? What do you want me to say, Lauren? His voice was tired in a way that went beyond this morning. She owns the house. She's selling the house. What exactly do you want me to do? Fight for it. It's not ours to fight for, he said it quietly, and the quietness of it was the first time I had heard my son say something true and unhedged in longer than I could immediately remember. He looked at me. I'm sorry, Mom. Nathan, no. He held up his hand toward Lauren without looking away from me. Let me say this. He swallowed. I let things go too far. I knew they were going wrong, and I kept telling myself it wasn't the right time to deal with it, and I kept letting you absorb the cost of that. The garage, his voice broke slightly on the word, and he stopped and steadied himself. The garage was not okay. I should have stopped that. I should have stopped a lot of things a lot earlier. And I didn't, and I'm sorry. The room was very quiet. Lauren looked at her husband as though he'd said something in a language she didn't recognize. I looked at my son at the specific way he was holding himself, at the exhaustion and the shame, and underneath it, something that might, given time, grow into something better, and I felt the complicated ache of being a mother in a moment like this. It was not satisfaction. It wasn't victory. It was grief and love braided together, so tightly they were indistinguishable. I hear you, I said. We'll talk more, but not now. Lauren did not accept it the way Nathan had. I had not expected her to. She spent the next 40 minutes in a state of escalating confrontation that moved through several phases: disbelief, then accusation, then bargaining, then a kind of furious calculation as she worked through the angles and found each one closed. "You planned this behind our backs," she said. "You went behind our backs and made this decision without giving us any chance." "The way you planned the garage," I said. "The way you made that decision behind my back. The way you drew up a renovation document that labeled the garage as my permanent residence without telling me. The way you moved Frank and Diane into my bedroom before I was even home to object." I kept my voice level. I kept my hands still. "I learned from watching you, Lauren. You showed me how decisions get made in this house." Her face went through several changes rapidly. I could see her realizing, for the first time, that I had known about the renovation plan. I had never mentioned it before. The knowledge that I'd known, that I'd been sitting with that knowledge while she was bringing me tea and calling me Mom, I could see that land on her like a physical thing. "That was just ideas," she said. "That wasn't—" "It had zoning notes," I said. "It had structural modification estimates." "Those aren't ideas, Lauren. Those are plans. You went through my private documents. You left your private documents in my garage. The garage you decided was my bedroom." She stopped. The logic of it had no exit. She knew it, and I could see that she knew it, and I felt in that moment none of the pleasure that movies suggest a person feels when they have irrefutably won an argument. I felt tired, not defeated tired, just the ordinary exhaustion of a woman who has spent months fighting a war she never wanted and has finally found the armistice. "Where are we supposed to go?" Lauren asked, and for the first time since she'd come downstairs, her voice lost its management quality. Under it was something younger and more frightened. She was not a monster. That was the uncomfortable truth I'd been living with through all of this. She had done monstrous things, or things that had felt monstrous on the receiving end, but she was a person frightened and cornered, and now facing a reality she'd believed she'd arranged to avoid. "Nathan and I are still getting back on our feet. 60 days is more than enough time to make a plan," I said. "I have some information about short-term rental options in the area if that would be useful." Patricia's office also has a list of tenant resource organizations. "I'll leave that information in the kitchen." She stared at me. "You're giving us pamphlets." "I'm giving you resources," I said. "More than you gave me when you decided I belonged in the garage." Another silence. Frank coughed. Diane looked at her hands. Then Lauren sat down. Not on the couch next to Nathan, on the chair across from it, alone, and she put her face in her hands, in a gesture that mirrored Nathan's from earlier, and she was quiet. I don't know what she was feeling. I don't know if it was remorse, or strategy, or simple shock. I had stopped trying to read Lauren's interior states months ago, because what was inside her was not mine to manage. What I knew was that the conversation was, for now, over. I stood up. I took the folder. I said, "To the room in general, Marcus will leave copies of the relevant paperwork with you. The closing date and the vacate timeline are on the top sheet. If you have legal questions, I'd encourage you to consult your own attorney." I paused. "Breakfast things are in the kitchen. I'm going to go for a drive." I walked out of the living room. I picked up my bag from the entryway. I walked out the front door into the cool May morning. I stood on my porch, the porch where I had sat in Harold's wicker chair on the night. Lauren moved me out of my bedroom, and I breathed the morning air. The street was quiet. A neighbor's sprinklers were going 2 houses down. A bird I couldn't see was doing something complicated and musical in the oak tree above me. I walked to my car. I got in. I sat for a moment. Then I started the engine and I drove. I drove for a long time. Not purposelessly. I had somewhere I was going. I just didn't go directly there. I drove through the neighborhood the long way, past the elementary school Nathan had attended, past the park where Harold and I had walked Biscuit every evening for 11 years, past the small diner on the corner of Aldrich and Fifth, where Harold and I had eaten Saturday morning pancakes for more years than I could count. I was not being sentimental, exactly. I was doing something that felt more like cataloging, committing things to a particular kind of memory, the kind that knows it's creating a record, rather than just experiencing a present. I was saying goodbye to things. Not dramatically, just honestly. I ended up at Patricia's office, which I had not arranged, but which felt entirely natural when I found myself in her parking lot. Her assistant let me in, and Patricia came out of her office with the look of someone who had been expecting a call and was not surprised by a person instead. How did it go? She asked. It went, I said. No one called the police. No one threw anything. My son apologized. I sat down in the chair across from her desk. Lauren didn't take it well. Did you expect her to? No, I put my bag on my lap. She asked where they were supposed to go. And for a moment, just a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. That's allowed, Patricia said. Is it? She drew up a plan to lock me into my own garage permanently. She moved her parents into my bedroom. She spent 14 months systematically dismantling my place in my own home. Yes, Patricia said, and you can still feel sorry for a person who does terrible things. One feeling doesn't cancel the other. She looked at me carefully. You're not wavering. No, I said, I'm just human. I'm allowed to be human about it. You are. She paused. Nathan apologized. He did. It wasn't everything I needed, but it was real. I could tell it was real because it was imperfect. He didn't have a speech. He just said he let things go too far and he should have stopped it earlier. I looked at my hands. He's right. He should have. What happens now? With Nathan? I don't know, I said honestly. That depends on him more than it depends on me. I'm not walking away from my son. But I'm also not absorbing any more cost on his behalf while he figures himself out. He's going to have to do some of that on his own. Patricia nodded. I have a property to look at tomorrow, I said. The one you mentioned, the one in Cedarfield. I remember. It's smaller, single level, good light. A real garden space in the back. A real garden space, I repeated. Harold always wanted a kitchen garden. Tomatoes and herbs, nothing elaborate. I never had time for it properly, because I was always managing the larger yard. I paused. I think I'd like to try it. Patricia smiled, a real one, not the professional version. That sounds exactly right. I want to tell you about the last evening I spent in the house on Sycamore Lane because it was nothing like what I had imagined it would be and everything like what it needed to be. I had expected it to be lonely. I had expected to walk through the rooms one final time and feel the accumulated weight of all the years bearing down Harold's presence. Nathan's childhood, the life I'd made and lost and partially remade in those walls. I had expected it to break something open in me. Instead, it was quiet. A different kind of quiet than the garage quiet. The whole house was still that last night. Everyone moving carefully around each other, like people in a hospital waiting room who don't know each other well enough to speak. Frank and Diane had spent the 2 weeks since my announcement making phone calls and arrangements, and there was something in their manner now that was subdued and slightly ashamed, not openly, but present a new awareness that they had benefited from something they perhaps had not examined carefully enough. Diane had come to me 3 days after the announcement and said, simply, I didn't know about the garage plan. I want you to know that. I had thanked her and told her I believed her and left it at that, because what was true, and what had happened, and neither one canceled the other. Lauren had been contained since the morning of the announcement. Not warm, that particular performance had ended entirely, but contained. She managed the logistics of their upcoming move with the focused efficiency she brought to everything she organized. And I gave her credit for that. It was practical. It was necessary. And it meant I did not have to watch her process anything in front of me. Nathan was the hardest to be around, in the way that love always makes proximity harder. He helped me begin moving my things into a storage unit, the things that would go to the new house, the things that needed to wait until the Cedarfield property closed 3 weeks after Sycamore. He carried boxes without being asked, and he didn't try to fill the silence with words, which was a mercy. At one point, carrying Harold's toolbox out to my car, he stopped and held it for a moment, looking at it. I remember when Dad bought this, he said. I was maybe 8. He took me to the hardware store, and we spent 2 hours in the tool aisle. He let you pick out the level, I said. Nathan looked up at me. Yeah, he did, a pause. I miss him. I know, I said. I do too. We stood there in the driveway, Nathan holding Harold's toolbox, me with a box of kitchen things balanced against my hip, and we were just two people who had loved the same man and had found ourselves, through a series of choices and failures and circumstances, standing on opposite sides of something that had cost both of them. I'm going to do better, Nathan said. It wasn't a performance. It was a man saying something true in the voice of someone who doesn't yet know exactly how, but is beginning to understand that the figuring out is his to do. I know you are, I said. And I meant it, not as a comfort, as a statement of what I actually believed, imperfectly, with appropriate caution. The way you believe something when you love someone, and you're also being honest." He nodded. We went back to carrying boxes. That last evening, I did walk through the house. After dinner, a meal nobody cooked, everyone ate separately and quietly from whatever was available. I went room by room while the light was fading, while the house was in that particular amber and shadow state that the evening always gave it. Light from the west, coming through the back windows and moving across the floors in long diagonals. I stood in the kitchen, and I put my hand on the counter where I'd stood for 40 years. The tile was the same tile I'd laid myself, the cool gray with the small white flecks. Harold had sat at that kitchen table every morning of his adult life in this house. I had stood at that window and looked at the backyard through every season it had. I went upstairs. Frank and Diane had already moved most of their things into boxes, and the room that had been mine was back to something closer to what it had been the furniture in its original positions, because they'd put it back before they moved it without my permission. Maybe, or because they understood finally that it mattered. The nail hole where the oval mirror had hung was still in the wall. I stood in front of it for a moment. I went to Nathan's old room. Empty now, the childhood things long since packed. The carpet still had the dent from where his bookshelf had stood. I stood at the top of the stairs, and I looked down the hallway, at the house I had known for 40 years, and I breathed, and I felt the grief of it, real grief, clean grief, the kind that doesn't pretend to be anything other than what it is. This had been a beautiful life. The house had held it honestly. The house was not the problem. The house had never been the problem. I went back down the stairs. I went to the garage. I lay on my narrow cot one last time. I looked at Harold's pegboard. In the morning, I would drive to Cedarfield to finalize the paperwork on my new place. It was smaller and brighter, and entirely mine, and I had already decided where the kitchen garden would go. But tonight I lay in the garage that they had made my home, and I let it be what it had become, not a humiliation anymore, but a record of what I had survived, and what I had decided, and who I had turned out to be when everything else was stripped away. An old woman in a garage with her husband's tools on the wall, who had looked at a future someone else had designed for her and said, "No, not this, not anymore." I turned off the small lamp. I lay in the dark. I had no idea, in that moment, that the hardest conversation, the one that would matter most, the one with Nathan, was still ahead of me, and that it would not go the way either of us expected. The conversation I had been dreading came 3 days before I left Sycamore Lane for the last time. I had known it was coming. Nathan had been circling it. For days I could see it in the way he moved around me, the way he'd start to say something, and then redirect, the way he'd linger in the garage doorway in the evenings when he brought me things I hadn't asked for, a glass of water, a plate with crackers and cheese, small offerings that were really just excuses to stand near me, without having to say what he actually needed to say. I recognized the behavior because I had watched him do it his entire life. Nathan had always been a person who needed to circle a difficult thing many times before he could land on it. Harold used to say their son approached hard conversations, like a dog approaching a strange smell cautiously, from multiple angles, ready to retreat at any moment. It was a Tuesday evening, 8 days after the morning I had told them the house was sold. Frank and Diane had already begun staying at an extended stay motel on the other side of town. Frank's pride had taken a particular hit, and he hadn't wanted to remain in the house any longer than necessary once the decision was final, which I respected, even if I hadn't expected it. Lauren was upstairs, audible through the ceiling as she packed boxes, with the focused, contained energy she'd been operating on since the announcement. The house had the feeling of a place being disassembled, half-empty rooms, boxes in hallways. The particular echoing quality spaces take on when the soft furnishings that absorbed sound have been removed. Nathan came to the garage at 7 o'clock. He knocked this time. He had started knocking after the announcement, and I noticed it every time without commenting on it. "Can I come in?" he asked. "Of course," I said. He came in and sat on an overturned plastic crate near the workbench, the same spot he'd sat as a teenager when he used to come out here and watch Harold work on weekend projects, asking questions about whatever Harold was building or fixing, learning the language of tools and patience that his father had wanted to pass on. I wondered if Nathan remembered that. I wondered if sitting in that spot was intentional, or if it was something his body had just remembered without telling him. He sat there for a moment, with his hands between his knees, and he looked at the floor. I waited. I had learned over 72 years, and particularly over the past several months, the value of waiting. I've been trying to figure out how to say this, he started. Take your time, I said. I've been trying to figure out how to say it in a way that sounds like enough. And I keep realizing there isn't a way, because it isn't enough. Whatever I say isn't going to be enough. He looked up. His eyes were dry, but there was something raw in them, something that had been scraped back to an earlier layer. I let my wife move my mother into a garage. That's what happened. And I knew it was wrong, and I told myself it was temporary, and I told myself you'd be okay, and I kept not dealing with it. Because dealing with it meant a fight with Lauren that I didn't have the energy for. He stopped. That's not an explanation. I know it's not. I'm not trying to explain it away. What are you trying to do? I asked. I'm trying to tell you the truth, he said, because I think I've been choosing the comfortable version of the truth for a long time. With Lauren, with myself, with you, and I'm tired of it. I looked at my son. I looked at the specific way the garage light fell on his face, the same face I had watched change from infant to child to man over 5 decades. The face that had Harold's jaw and my eyes and its own particular arrangement of features that I had cataloged so thoroughly I could close my eyes and draw it. He was 44 years old, and he looked in this moment both much younger and much older than that. The night you told me the house was sold, he said, I went upstairs and Lauren was furious, really furious, and she wanted me to be furious with her. She kept saying you'd blindsided us, you'd done it behind our backs, you'd been deceptive. And I sat there and I listened to her, and I thought, he paused and rubbed the back of his neck. I thought we moved her into the garage. We did that. Lauren planned it and I let it happen, and we moved my mother into the garage and we called it temporary, and now she's done exactly what we did. She made a decision without telling us, and Lauren is calling it a betrayal. He looked at me directly. I couldn't make myself agree with her. I tried, and I couldn't. That must have been a difficult evening, I said. And I meant it without sarcasm. Because it was true being the person in a marriage who finally sees something clearly when the other person is not there yet is its own specific kind of alone. We've been talking, Nathan said. Lauren and I real talking, not the kind we'd been doing for a long time, where we were really just managing each other. He exhaled. I don't know what's going to happen with us. I'm not going to tell you everything's fine because it isn't. But I'm not going to keep pretending that what happened here was okay. And I'm not going to let her rewrite it into a story where you're the one who did something wrong. Quiet in the garage, after he said that was different from the quiet before it. It had a different texture. Nathan, I said, I need you to hear something. He waited. I'm not going to tell you your marriage is over, or that Lauren is irredeemable, or any of the things you might expect me to say. That's not my judgment to make. I paused, finding the exact words, because this mattered and I wanted them to be exact. What I'm going to tell you is what I need from you. Not what I want, not what would make me feel better in the short term. What I actually need as your mother going forward. Okay, he said. I need you to be someone I can trust, I said. Not someone who loves me, I know you love me. I've never doubted that, not even in the worst of what happened here. Love was never the question. The question was whether you would protect me when protecting me was inconvenient. And the answer, for too long, was no. I let that sit. I need that answer to change, not through apologies. Through what you actually do over time, in situations where it would be easier to look the other way. He nodded. He was not crying, but his jaw was working the way it did when he was holding something in. I'm not closing the door, I said. I want to be clear about that. You're my son. That door is not closed. But it's not automatically open the way it used to be either. You have to come through it. You have to show me, over time, that you understand what happened here and why it can't happen again. I understand, he said, do you? Tell me. He thought about it. He didn't answer immediately, which was the right response. The right response was not the one that came instantly, the one that had been prepared. The right response was the one that required actual thought. I understand, he said finally, that you trusted me, that you opened your home because I asked you to, because I was struggling, and you loved me enough to say yes without hesitation, and that I paid that back by making myself invisible while my wife dismantled your place in your own house, and that every time you gave me a chance to fix it, I chose the easier path. He paused. I understand that the garage wasn't just a room. It was what I was telling you about how much you mattered, and what I was telling you was not enough. Not enough, Mom. His voice broke on the last 2 words. not dramatically. Just the small, clean break that happens when something true comes through a place that's been defended for too long. I sat in my camping chair in the garage, where I had spent weeks of my life that I would never get back, and I looked at my son on his overturned crate, and I felt the specific ache of a love that is permanent and complicated, and not contingent on any of this, not on what he'd done or what I'd done, or what any of it had cost. I loved him the way you love someone you made from scratch. Nothing that had happened changed that. Nothing that would happen could. But love without accountability is just sentiment. And I was too old and had paid too high a price to let sentiment substitute for truth. Okay, I said. Okay, we start from here, I said. Not from the garage and not from 40 years ago. From here, from what you just said and what I just said and what's actually true between us. I looked at him steadily. And Nathan, whatever happens with you and Lauren, I need you to make your own choices. Not choices that manage her feelings or avoid her reactions. Your own choices. You're 44 years old. You are allowed to have your own choices. He nodded. Something in his posture changed slightly, a releasing of something that had been held. I love you, I said. I'm still angry at you. Both things are true. He almost smiled. I know, he said. That sounds right. We sat in Harold's garage for a while longer, not talking much, just existing in the same space the way people can when they've said the things that needed saying, and the silence after is honest rather than avoidant. Nathan helped me carry a few more boxes to the storage pile near the garage door. He held Harold's anniversary photograph carefully when he moved it, the one from our 25th, both of us squinting into the sun. He'd have had a lot to say about all of this, Nathan said, looking at the photograph. He would have said it quietly, I said, once. And it would have been enough. Nathan set the photograph gently on the top of the box. Yeah, he said. It would have. Closing on Sycamore Lane was on a Thursday morning. I sat across a wide table from Marcus and Claire and Patricia and the buyer's representatives, and I signed my name to papers that transferred 40 years of my life to a young couple who were not there in person but whose realtor described them, when I asked, as nervous and excited and already planning the nursery. I signed my name clearly and without hesitation, and when the last signature was done, I sat for a moment with the pen still in my hand, and I thought about Harold and about the first time we'd signed papers for that house, how young we were, how frightened of the mortgage, how certain in spite of the fear that we were building something real. We had built something real, and it had stood for 40 years, and now it would hold a new family's beginning, and my name would be in the county records as the woman who had owned it and cared for it and eventually let it go. I put the pen down. I thanked everyone at the table. I shook Marcus's hand and he said, "Take care of yourself, Evelyn," with the warmth of someone who has been through something with a person rather than just for them. I walked out into the June morning and I stood on the sidewalk and I breathed. Then I drove to Cedarfield. The house in Cedarfield was a single story on a quiet street with a narrow front porch and a backyard that was mostly open space, good soil, Patricia had said, noting it because I'd mentioned the kitchen garden. It was smaller than Sycamore Lane by more than half. 3 rooms and a good bathroom and a kitchen with a window over the sink that looked out at the backyard, the same way my old kitchen window had, which was not something I'd noticed in the listing photographs, but which struck me the moment I walked in, that first real day of occupancy, as something that felt less like coincidence and more like continuity. I had spent the 2 weeks between closing on Sycamore and moving into Cedarfield in a motel, a decent one, clean and quiet, where I had eaten room service breakfast and slept in a bed that was neither the narrow cot nor the grand bed I'd had for 40 years, but something in between, something neutral, a pause between chapters. I had used those 2 weeks to do things I had been putting off. I'd had dinner twice with my oldest friend Carolyn, who lived 20 minutes away and who had been watching the situation at Sycamore with worried long-distance attention, and who, when I told her the whole of it over soup and bread at her kitchen table, said nothing for a long moment, and then said, "Evelyn Ruth Carter, I have been waiting 20 years for you to stop letting people take advantage of your kindness and call it love. Has it been that obvious?" I asked. "To everyone except you," she said, not unkindly. I had also, during those 2 weeks, made a phone call I'd been thinking about for months. I had found, through some research and one conversation with Patricia, an organization called the Alderman House. They were a nonprofit that worked specifically with elderly individuals, mostly women, mostly widowed or divorced, mostly in situations where housing and financial stability were precarious because of family dynamics or inadequate planning or simple vulnerability. They ran a legal resource line and a housing assistance program and a peer support network. They did not have enough funding. They did not have enough visibility. They did the kind of work that doesn't make headlines because the people it helps are the people society has decided not to look at too directly. I spoke with their director, a woman named Gloria Hirsch, who had a no-nonsense manner and a laugh that came out of nowhere when something genuinely amused her. I told her who I was and what had happened to me, and what I was considering doing. She listened without interrupting, which seemed to be a quality shared by all the people I was coming to trust most. "We have a waiting list," she told me when I'd finished. "For the legal consultation line, specifically. Women who are in situations like yours, or worse, who can't afford private attorneys. We have volunteer attorneys who give time, but we can't cover the need." "What would funding do?" I asked. She told me. She was specific and practical, and didn't oversell it, which made me trust the numbers. She told me what a full-time legal advocate would cost per year. She told me what the Housing Stabilization Fund could do with a certain amount of operating capital. She told me about a woman who'd been helped the previous year, not her name, just her situation, a woman in her late 60s who'd nearly signed over her house to a family member under duress, who'd found the Alderman House resource line at 11 o'clock at night on a desperate Tuesday, and who was now living independently in a place she'd found through their housing network. "How soon could you use a contribution?" I asked. "Yesterday," Gloria said, and then the laugh came, unexpected and real, and I found myself smiling. Moving into Cedarfield, I made the contribution I had decided on. A significant one, not the entirety of the Sycamore proceeds, not irresponsibly, because I was 72 years old and I had to be practical about the rest of my life, but significant. Enough to fund the full-time legal advocate for 2 years and seed the Housing Stabilization Fund with a meaningful amount. Marcus had helped me understand what I could responsibly give and still have a life that was secure and comfortable and mine. I did not announce it. I did not make a ceremony of it. I transferred the funds through Patricia's office and I received a confirmation from Gloria Hirsch, and that was that. There was no plaque with my name on it. There was no event in my honor. There was just the knowledge, quiet and solid, that somewhere out there a phone line would be staffed by someone who knew family property law, and a woman in a desperate Tuesday night situation would be able to call it. Harold would have approved. That was my private measure of anything I did that was larger than my own immediate life. Would Harold approve? The answer, in this case, was yes, and without hesitation, because Harold Carter had spent his life believing that people had an obligation to the community they lived inside, and that the most vulnerable people in any community were the ones who'd earned the most protection. The kitchen garden went in during the last week of June. I had done my proper research, with library books, and 2 conversations with a man at the garden center who knew his business and didn't condescend to me when I asked questions. I prepared the soils in the section of the Cedarfield backyard that got the most direct sun, working in the early mornings before the day heated up. I planted tomatoes, 3 varieties. Because I'd learned, I had opinions about tomatoes and basil and flat-leaf parsley and a row of green beans along the back fence, and, on impulse, a single zucchini plant that I knew would produce more zucchini than any one person could reasonably use, but which I planted anyway because Harold had loved zucchini bread, and the impulse felt like something I owed him. The physical work was harder than it used to be. My back reminded me, daily, that I was 72. My knees had opinions, but there was something in the doing of it, the specific, honest labor of making something grow in ground, that was mine, that felt like the best kind of answer to everything that had happened. You can take a woman's bedroom. You can redesign her living room. You can box up her pottery and rearrange her kitchen and write her into the corner of a document as a permanent inconvenience. But you cannot take her hands. You cannot take what her hands know how to do. I was in the garden on a Saturday morning in early July when my phone rang. Nathan. I sat back on my heels and looked at the screen for a moment, dirt on my gloves, the morning sun already warm on my shoulders. Then I answered. "Mommy said, how are you?" "I'm good," I said. "I'm in the garden. How are you?" A pause. "Lauren and we're separating." He said it carefully, as though the word might break something. "We've been talking to someone, a counselor, And we came to it together, actually. It wasn't a fight. It was more like an honest conversation about who we are and where we're going, and whether those things are compatible. Another pause. I thought you should know. I sat in my garden in the July morning, and I felt the complicated weight of that information, the grief of it, because no matter what Lauren had done, a marriage ending was a loss. And Nathan was my son, and his losses were never simple for me. And underneath the grief, something else. Not satisfaction, I want to be clear about that. Not the small, mean satisfaction of being proven right. Something quieter and more serious. The sense of a man beginning to find his own ground. Are you okay? I asked. I don't know yet. I think I will be. A pause. I found an apartment. It's small. It's actually kind of terrible, honestly. The carpet is this color that I can't even describe. Burnt orange, I said. All bad apartments have burnt orange carpet. It's a law. He laughed. A real laugh, short and surprised, and hearing it was worth more than I could have measured. Yeah, he said. Burnt orange. It smells like someone's grandmother's basement. You'll fix it up, I said. Get some decent lighting. Put something green near the window. Is that advice? That's advice. Another pause. Quieter, Mom. I'd like to see you. That's okay. Not to, I'm not coming to ask for anything. I just want to see you. Come for lunch, I said. Sunday. I'll make something. Yeah? Yes. Bring something for dessert. Something good. Don't bring those cookies from the gas station you used to think. I didn't know you ate. Another laugh. Okay, Sunday. Sunday, I said. Now let me get back to my garden. I hung up and sat in the quiet backyard of my field house, and I held the phone, and I looked at the tomato plants I'd put in the ground 3 weeks ago, already climbing their stakes, already doing what they were supposed to do when given good soil and enough light and the basic conditions for growth. People I thought are not so different. Given the right conditions, they grow toward what they're supposed to be. Take those conditions away, and they survive in whatever way they can, which is sometimes sideways and sometimes mean and sometimes desperate. Nathan had been growing sideways for years inside a marriage that had gradually stopped giving him the conditions he needed to be the person I knew he was capable of being. I was not glad his marriage was ending, but I was quietly, privately hopeful about what might grow in the space after. Sunday came. Nathan came. He brought a pie from a bakery I hadn't heard of, a proper bakery, with a paper box tied with string, and he stood at my door in Cedarfield and looked around the small entryway with Harold's photograph on the console table and my pottery collection back on a windowsill where it belonged, and the smell of something cooking from the kitchen. It's nice, he said, and he meant it. I could tell he meant it. Come in, I said. We ate lunch at my small kitchen table, 2 people, 2 plates. The kitchen window opened to let in the summer air and the specific green smell of the garden beyond it. We talked the way people talk when they've been through something real together and survived it, not constantly, not filling every silence, but honestly when we did speak. He told me about the apartment and his work and a friend he'd reconnected with that he'd lost touch with over the years of the marriage. I told him about the Alderman House donation, which I had not told him before, and he was quiet for a moment. How much? He asked. Enough, I said. He nodded slowly. That's a good thing to do with it. I thought so. Dad would have said the same thing. He would have said it was the obvious thing and been baffled that it needed explaining to anyone, I said. Nathan smiled. Yeah, that's exactly how he would have said it. After lunch, he helped me with a section of the garden fence that needed reinforcing, a post that had loosened in the ground, requiring digging and resetting, the kind of work I could have managed alone, but which went faster with 2 people. We worked in the afternoon sun without too much talking, and it was, in its plain way, the best thing that had happened between us in a very long time. Not a resolution, I want to be honest about that. You don't resolve 14 months of accumulated failure with a Sunday lunch and a fence post. What you do is begin, and beginning is not nothing. Beginning is, in fact, everything, because without it there is only the weight of what happened and nothing after it. When he left, he hugged me at the door. A real hug, not the careful, managing kind he'd been giving me for too long. Kind that meant something. Thank you, he said, for not giving up on me. I almost did, I said, because that was the true thing, and he deserved the true thing. Not on you as my son, but on the version of you that let his wife move his mother into the garage. I gave up on that version. I needed that version to be gone. He pulled back and looked at me. Is it gone? I looked at my son in the doorway of my new house, in the afternoon light of a July Sunday, with garden dirt still on both our hands and a paper pie box empty on the kitchen counter behind me. Ask me in a year, I said. Ask me when I've had more to go on. He nodded. Fair, he said. Fair enough. He walked to his car. He waved once before he got in. I stood on my small front porch and I watched him drive away, and I stood there for a while after his car had disappeared around the corner, just standing in the quiet of my own street, in front of my own house, on my own terms. I want to tell you what I know now that I didn't know, on the night I first lay down on that narrow cot in Harold's garage. Not lessons. Exactly, I don't believe in lessons as tidy things, packaged and labeled and ready for application. I believe in what you understand when you've been through something and come out the other side and had time to look back at it clearly. I know that kindness and weakness are not the same thing, but they live close enough together that you have to watch the border carefully. I was kind. I have always been kind. And for too long, I let people use my kindness as a road straight into the center of my life, where they rearranged everything to suit themselves and called it family. Kindness that has no boundary is not a virtue. It is an open door that certain people will walk through all the way to your bedroom before you understand what's happened. I know that love, real love, the kind between parents and children, and between people who have built a life together, does not come with a price tag, but it also does not come without weight. Nathan loved me. I never stopped believing that. But his love had become weightless. It floated above the difficult moments instead of standing inside them. A love that disappears when it's needed is a love that hasn't matured into what it's supposed to be. Loving your mother should cost you sometimes. It should cost you the hard conversation with your spouse. It should cost you the discomfort of standing in the way of something wrong. Nathan had been paying the cheapest possible price for his love of me, and we had both been pretending that was enough. I know that there is a particular cruelty in the exact. Old women should be grateful for whatever space they're given, should accommodate whatever arrangements others find convenient, should make themselves small and quiet and manageable and call it dignity. Lauren had not invented that expectation. It had been waiting in the culture, waiting in a dozen unspoken assumptions, and she had simply recognized it and used it the way a shrewd person uses whatever tools are available. The assumption was, you are old, therefore you are past the point of having needs that matter. The assumption was, you should be thankful to be included. The assumption was, your history in this house, your decades of labor, your name on the deed, all of that should yield to the comfort of people who are younger, and therefore somehow more entitled to the present. No, I am here to tell you. No, I know that the moment I stopped waiting to be treated well and started taking action to ensure my own well-being was the moment I became useful to myself again. Not to anyone else, to myself. And that is not selfishness. That is the basic, necessary act of treating your own life as something worth protecting. I know that Patricia Osie's phone number, kept in my phone for 3 years after Harold's estate was settled, was worth more than I can calculate. Keep the numbers of people who have proven themselves. Keep them, and do not be ashamed to use them. Do not wait until you are in crisis to remember that you have resources. Do not wait until the garage to understand that you have rights. And I know this is the thing I turn over most often, in the quiet of my Cedarfield evenings, that what I lost and what I gained were not opposites. I lost the house. I lost 40 years of familiar walls, and the specific sound of those floorboards, and the nail hole from the oval mirror, and the sight of the oak tree from my kitchen window every morning. Those losses are real.
I am not going to tell you they don't matter, because they do.
Grief does not require justification or minimization. Things can be lost, and the loss can be mourned, and both can be true at the same time as the knowledge that the choice was right. What I gained was the end of the long, slow disappearance. That is the thing I had not been able to name until I was out of it the way I had been disappearing, piece by piece from my own life. Not dramatically. That's what made it so dangerous. No single moment of it was so egregious that I could point to it and say, there. That's where it happened. It was the pottery figurines in a box. It was the kitchen towels. It was the reorganized cabinets. It was a long sequence of small removals. And at the end of them, I was sleeping in the garage of my own house and wondering how I'd gotten there. I got there because I was kind without limit, because I loved without boundary, because I believed that my family's comfort was worth more than my dignity, for long enough that they began to believe it too. I will not make that mistake again. Not out of bitterness. Bitterness is just another form of letting other people define your interior life, and I'm done with that. Out of clarity. Out of the hard-won understanding that my dignity is not negotiable. That my home, whatever home, wherever it is, regardless of its square footage, or the quality of its carpet, or whether it has a grand oak tree in the front yard, is mine. That I am allowed to take up space. That I am allowed to matter. The Alderman House, when I checked in with Gloria Hirsch in August, told me the legal advocate position had been filled a woman named Dr. Sandra Klein, a family law attorney who had decided to spend a portion of her practice in direct service after watching too many older clients get steamrolled by the family members they loved. Gloria said the consultation line had already fielded 63 calls in its first month of full operation. She said the Housing Stabilization Fund had helped 2 families. She said they were growing. 63 women who called a phone line in their difficult Tuesday nights and found someone who answered. 63. I thought about each of them, nameless and real, sitting in whatever version of the garage they were living inside, afraid and unsure and needing a voice that told them clearly, you have standing. You have rights. You do not have to accept this. That is what I wanted to do with what happened to me. Not perform it as a tragedy or a triumph. Not turn it into a story with clean edges and satisfying resolution, because real life does not have those, and anyone who tells you differently is selling you something. I wanted to turn it into fuel for the women still sitting in the dark, still waiting to understand that they are allowed to do what I did. You are allowed to say no. You are allowed to say enough. You are allowed to make the decision that everyone around you insists you cannot make, the one that rearranges everything, the one that costs them the comfort they built on your sacrifice. You are allowed to sell the house they were counting on inheriting, while they still thought you were too confused, or too defeated, or too old to understand the paperwork. You are allowed to be the most capable person in the room that underestimated you. In September, I went back to Sycamore Lane once. Not to look at the house, I had no desire to stand in front of someone else's life and compare it to mine. I went because Carolyn lives 2 streets over, and we had a standing Saturday lunch date, and I drove through the old neighborhood on the way. I didn't slow down in front of the house. I passed it the way you pass anything that was once your daily reality and is now simply part of the world present, real, not yours. But I saw the oak tree, from the road at normal speed through my car window. It was September, and the leaves were beginning their long turn toward the colors. Harold had loved the yellow greens and the first hints of amber at the tips. It was large and healthy and beautiful, the tree I had planted 40 years ago when it was a stick with 3 leaves. I had planted that. Whatever else had happened in and around that house, I had planted that tree. I kept driving. Carolyn made soup, and we talked for 3 hours, the way old friends talk, ranging across decades and returning to the present and ranging out again, and at one point she looked at me across the table and said, "You look different." Different how? She thought about it. Like yourself, she said. You look like yourself. I hadn't realized you'd stopped looking like yourself until just now that you do again. I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't say anything. I just sat with it, the way you sit with things that are true and sufficient and don't need anything added to them. On the drive home to Cedarfield, to my small bright house with the kitchen garden out back, and Harold's photograph on the console table and the pottery figurines where they belonged, I thought about what Carolyn had said, Bud. And I thought about the night in the garage. The first night, lying on the narrow cot in the dark with the house sounds above me, and Harold's pegboard on the wall, and the quiet turning that had happened in me. The key turning in the lock. I had made a promise that night. Not to be treated well, I couldn't make that promise, because I can't control what other people do, but to stop absorbing the cost of being treated badly, to stop calling that absorption love, to recognize the difference between sacrifice that builds something and sacrifice that funds someone else's ambition. I had kept the promise. My tomatoes by the end of September had produced more than I could use alone. I left bags of them on Carolyn's porch and on the porch of my neighbor Margaret, who was in her late 60s and recently widowed and learning, as I was still learning, how to construct a life that belongs fully to yourself. I made zucchini bread 2 loaves and brought one to the Alderman house the next time I stopped in to check on things, which I had begun doing once a month not as a donor inspecting her investment, but as a person who wanted to know that the work was continuing. Gloria Hirsch accepted the zucchini bread without making anything of it, which is exactly the right way to accept a zucchini bread. The second loaf I kept for myself. I ate it over the course of a week, mornings with coffee, sit in my kitchen window looking out at the garden where the plants were winding down for the season, the tomato vines yellowing, the basil going to seed, the zucchini plant finally exhausted after its extraordinary summer of production. I sat at my window in my house on my own terms, and I ate zucchini bread and I drank my coffee, and it's outside the light changed the way October light changes, going lower and more golden every day, and I was here for it. I was present for it. I had not been diminished into the corner of someone else's plan. I had not been managed or accommodated or quietly erased. I was 72 years old, and I was, for the first time and longer than I wanted to admit, exactly where I chose to be. They thought they had pushed an old woman into a corner, into a garage, into the margins of the life she'd built. They had pushed her into the clearest decision she'd ever made. And she had made it. And she was here, in the October light, drinking her coffee, growing her tomatoes, answering her phone when her son called on Sundays, imperfectly, carefully, one honest conversation at a time, and living, fully and on her own terms, the life she had reclaimed. Not because anyone gave it back to her, because she took it back herself. That is the only way it ever works. My tomatoes, by the end of September, had produced more than I could use alone. I left bags of them on Carolyn's porch, and on the porch of my neighbor Margaret, who was in her late 60s and recently widowed and learning, as I was still learning, how to construct a life that belongs fully to yourself. I made zucchini bread 2 loaves and brought one to the Alderman house the next time I stopped in to check on things, which I had begun doing once a month, not as a donor inspecting her investment, but as a person who wanted to know that the work was continuing. Gloria Hirsch accepted the zucchini bread without making anything of it, which is exactly the right way to accept a zucchini bread. The second loaf I kept for myself. I ate it over the course of a week, mornings with coffee, sit in my kitchen window looking out at the garden where the plants were winding down for the season, the tomato vines yellowing, the basil going to seed, the zucchini plant finally exhausted after its extraordinary summer of production. I sat at my window in my house on my own terms, and I ate zucchini bread and I drank my coffee, and it's outside the light changed the way October light changes, going lower and more golden every day, and I was here for it. I was present for it. I had not been diminished into the corner of someone else's plan. I had not been managed or accommodated or quietly erased. I was 72 years old, and I was, for the first time and longer than I wanted to admit, exactly where I chose to be. They thought they had pushed an old woman into a corner, into a garage, into the margins of the life she'd built. They had pushed her into the clearest decision she'd ever made. And she had made it. And she was here, in the October light, drinking her coffee, growing her tomatoes, answering her phone when her son called on Sundays, imperfectly, carefully, one honest conversation at a time, and living, fully and on her own terms, the life she had reclaimed. Not because anyone gave it back to her, because she took it back herself. That is the only way it ever works.